I've always been a skeptical person. I never believed in stories of hauntings, mysterious invasions, or things like that. But that night, something happened in my house that I just can't explain to this day. I woke up suddenly with the shrill sound of the alarm going off. The heart shot at the same moment. I live alone and have never had problems with security, so that caught me completely off guard. I jumped out of bed, still a little groggy, and took my cell phone to check the monitoring app. All doors and windows were closed. There were no signs of burglary. Even so, the alarm was manually deactivated from the panel in the room. My first thought was that someone had entered. Maybe an intruder was inside my house at that moment. I took a baseball bat that I left next to the bed and walked slowly down the corridor. The house was in absolute silence, but I felt that strange pressure in the air, as if I was being watched. I checked each room, one by one. Nothing. No open door, no broken window, no strange movement. But when I got to the room, I felt a chill in my spine when I saw the alarm panel. It was off, and worse, the lid was open, as if someone had messed with it minutes before. I stood there, trying to find a logical explanation for that. Maybe a problem in the system? A short circuit? But the idea didn't make sense, because the alarm was manually deactivated. I would have heard any noise if someone had come in. Still, I checked behind the furniture, inside the cabinets, even under the table. Nothing. The house was exactly as I had left it before going to sleep. Even so, the feeling that there was something wrong did not leave me. My mind insisted on the possibility that someone could be there with me, hidden somewhere that I hadn't checked. I tried to calm down. I turned on the alarm again and went back to the room, but it was impossible to sleep. I lay down, looking at the ajar door, listening to the heavy silence of the house. I just needed to wait until dawn, convince myself that it had been a system error, and move on with life. But then, while staring at the darkness of the corridor, I saw. The alarm panel flashed a red light, indicating that it had been deactivated again. Only this time, I was looking directly at him. My body frosted. I was looking directly at the panel and saw when the red light flashed, indicating that the alarm was turned off. But I didn't hear any button clicks, no noise, nothing. I got out of bed with my heart racing and went to the living room, moved by pure instinct. I touched the panel, still hot, as if someone had pressed the button seconds ago. But I was alone. I looked around, every corner of the room, trying to find any sign of movement. The sofa, the table, the carpet, everything was exactly as before. But somehow, I knew someone was there. I went back to the room, closing the door and locking it. I took my cell phone and thought about calling the police, but what would I say? My alarm turned off by itself twice? There were no signs of burglary, nothing stolen, no evidence that someone had entered. I felt ridiculous. Still, I decided I wouldn't sleep anymore that night. I sat on the bed, cell phone in my hand, waiting for the slightest sign that something was wrong. And then, around 3 in the morning, I heard the most subtle and terrifying sound possible. The click of the doorknob of my room moving slowly. I was completely motionless, holding my breath. The room was dark, only the weak light of the cell phone illuminated my trembling hands. The doorknob didn't turn completely, but that slight movement was enough to paralyze me. Someone was outside. My heart was beating so hard that I could hear it in my ears. I walked away slowly, trying not to make noise. I took a heavy object that was on the dresser, a small lamp, and held it tight, as if that was enough to protect me. I expected some other sound, any indication that the person was still there. But nothing happened. Just an overwhelming silence, which somehow was even worse. After a few minutes, without any more movements on the handle, I got up the courage and approached slowly. I put my ear on the door and was attentive. No sound of footsteps, no breathing, nothing. It could be my paranoia, but the feeling of being watched was almost suffocating. I opened my cell phone and accessed the camera app. I went through each of them, living room, kitchen, hallway. Everything seemed normal, until I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The room camera, which was previously positioned to catch the view of the front door, was now facing the wall. That didn't make sense. I hadn't moved the camera position, and even if I had, it didn't move by itself. Someone should have done this manually. My whole body got tense. This meant that, at some point that night, someone was inside my house. I tried to think rationally. Maybe the support would have given in, and she would have turned on her own. But the idea didn't convince me. Even if this were true, how to explain the disabled alarm? And the movement on the doorknob? A wave of dread took over me. I needed to get out of there, but the idea of opening the door terrified me even more. I took my cell phone and dialed the police number, but before pressing to call, a thought paralyzed me. What if I was exaggerating? What if it was a technical problem, a bad contact in the security system? They would come here, they wouldn't find anything, and I would be embarrassed. But at the same time, something inside me said that it wasn't just a technical mistake. I took a deep breath and convinced myself that it was better to look paranoid than to risk it. Before leaving the room, I took a knife from the desk drawer. Not that it made me safer, but at least I didn't feel completely helpless. I walked to the bedroom door as quietly as possible. I leaned my ear on the wood, trying to catch any sound outside. Nothing. The silence was absolute, but somehow it only made my anxiety worse. I held the doorknob and turned it slowly, feeling my heart beating hard in my chest. With every inch I opened, the feeling that something was waiting for me on the other side only increased. When I finally opened the door, I came across the empty corridor. The weak light of the pole on the street lightly illuminated the room, projecting elongated shadows through the furniture. Everything looked exactly as I had left before going to sleep. With cautious steps, I followed the corridor to the living room, holding the knife tightly. My gaze went straight to the alarm panel. The green light flashed, indicating that he was deactivated. My stomach turned. Someone had really messed with it there. I went to the front door, checked the lock. Locked. The windows all closed. There were no signs of burglary, no evidence that someone had left or entered. But then a detail made me freeze. The keys I always left on the table next to the door were now on the floor, as if they had been knocked down. And I knew they weren't there before. I swallowed dry and looked around, trying to find some logical explanation. Maybe I had dropped the keys the day before and hadn't noticed. Maybe the alarm panel had given some kind of failure and deactivated itself. I wanted to believe that, but the feeling that there was something wrong didn't leave me alone. With heavy breathing, I took the keys from the floor and checked the door again. Nothing had been forced, and yet, I felt that I was not alone there. My mind began to work fast, trying to remember every detail. I had locked everything before going to sleep. There were no footsteps, no suspicious movement, but someone had deactivated the alarm. I went back to the panel and looked at the screen. The deactivation time was recorded, 3:12 a.m. I looked at the cell phone watch. 3:19. It had happened just 7 minutes ago. A chill ran down my spine. 7 minutes. If someone was inside the house, they could still be there. I held my cell phone tightly and in slow steps went to the kitchen, opening the drawer where I kept a knife. My mind tried to rationalize, but my body was tense, ready to react to anything. I looked towards the corridor that led to the other rooms. Everything seemed to be in place, but the silence now seemed heavier. I decided to check the rooms one by one, keeping my breathing controlled. First, the bathroom. The door was leaning, but when I turned on the light, I saw that it was empty. Then the office. No sign of burglary, no open window. Finally, the living room. I looked around, the furniture, the sofa, the TV off. And then, my gaze stopped on the alarm panel. The alarm panel was exactly as the video showed, manually disabled. But what made me freeze was something I hadn't noticed before. The dust around the buttons. Almost the entire surface was covered by a thin layer of dust, except for the area around the numeric keypad, as if someone had passed their hand there recently. My heart raced. I hadn't touched this panel in weeks. Who touched him? The house was all locked. I checked the front door once more. The safety chain was still in place. No broken windows. No sign of invasion. But somehow someone was there. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed, holding the knife, unable to sleep. When the sun began to rise, reality hit me hard. There was no logical explanation for that. No sign of burglary, no footprint, nothing stolen. Just an alarm deactivated by an invisible hand. The next morning, I contacted the security company. They checked the system and confirmed that the code used to disable the alarm was mine. But I knew it hadn't been me. Since that night, I've never been able to sleep with the bedroom door open. When I moved to that apartment, I was excited. The building was old, but well maintained, and the view from the top floor was incredible. The first nights were quiet, until one morning, I was woken up by heavy steps on the ceiling. They were not snats of the structure or common noises of an old building. They were steps, clearly of someone walking from one side to the other. I stirred in bed, trying to ignore, but it continued for long minutes, as if someone was patrolling the space above me. The next night, the noise came back. This time, stronger and more insistent. It looked like someone was dragging something heavy, maybe a piece of furniture. But how was that possible? I knew you lived on the top floor. The next day, I went down to talk to the doorman. I asked casually if anyone lived above me. He looked at me confused before saying, "Above your apartment? There's only the concrete roof, ma'am. There is no more floor." I tried to laugh at the situation, saying that it must be the building creaking, but inside, I was restless. I went back to the apartment determined to find a logical explanation. Maybe some pipe was vibrating, or the pigeons I saw on the roof were causing the noise. However, that night, the steps came back, sharper than ever. Now I could distinguish a rhythm, as if someone was walking slowly, stopping sometimes, as if I were listening to something. I decided to record the sound with my cell phone. I turned on the recording app and left the device on the table while I locked myself in the room. The steps continued for almost an hour before stopping abruptly. When I heard the recording the next day, my skin shivered. Between the steps, there was a light sound of breathing. Not from my neighbors, not from the street, but from someone very close, as if he were on the ceiling, breathing low and measured, listening to my every movement inside the apartment. That night, the feeling of being observed was even more intense. I was lying in bed, trying to convince myself that all that was just my imagination, but the sound started again. Slow, heavy steps, followed by an almost imperceptible breath. I was alone, locked in my apartment, and the sound came clearly from the ceiling, as if someone was upstairs. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Squeezing the cell phone in my hand, I decided to leave the room. With my hands shaking, I went to the kitchen, took a large knife, and tried to rationalize it. It was not possible that anyone was there. The building was new, well built, and there was no way someone was on the roof without being noticed. But when I started walking around the room, the steps stopped. They were in absolute silence. It was at this moment that I realized that the silence was not comforting, but alarming. Because now it was clear, it wasn't something natural. Something or someone was there, and I couldn't understand what or why. The light breathing and the steps were waiting. And I, for some reason, felt that all this had to do with me. I stood in the middle of the room for a few minutes, trying to decide what to do. My mind was accelerated, thinking about all the possibilities, but none of them made sense. Finally, I took courage and went to the window in order to see something that could explain what was happening. The night was dark and the building seemed silent, as if nothing had happened. I looked at the roof, as if I expected to see something there, but it was empty, with no sign of movement. I then decided to call the doorman again, asking him to check if there was any problem in the building. He looked tired when he answered, but he was polite to inform me that the building was in perfect order, with no maintenance scheduled for that night. I felt a chill when I heard your answer. How was it possible? I was sure that the steps were not something in my head. After the call, the fear increased even more. I was alone and felt that the environment around me was different, heavier. I went back to the living room, trying to calm down, and that's when the sound came back. Now stronger, clearer. The steps were there again, running through the ceiling above me. I couldn't reason properly anymore. The feeling of being watched was so strong that I could barely breathe. I was terrified, but I knew I needed to do something. So I decided to take my things and leave the apartment to go to the concierge in person. When I went out to the hallway, I quickly passed through the door of the apartment next door and knocked. No one answered. There was no one around. When I looked at the end of the corridor, everything was too quiet. And then the sound stopped again. I went back to my apartment, still with my heart racing, trying to understand what was happening. I sat on the couch, trying to take a deep breath, and suddenly, as if the universe was mocking me, the sound came back. But this time it was different. The steps were closer, heavier, and seemed to move towards my door. Panic took hold of me and, without thinking, I ran to the kitchen, took a chef's knife and held it with both hands, as if it were some kind of protection. I stood there in the dark room, listening to the sound, without the courage to move. The steps were now so clear that it looked like someone was walking inside my apartment, but no one was there. I was absolutely alone, and the only thing that made noise was that sound coming from the ceiling. The feeling of not being alone paralyzed me, and with every step that echoed, I felt as if someone was getting closer and closer to me. I started to wonder if I was going crazy, if all that was just a hallucination, but the fear was too real to be ignored. That's when a terrible idea occurred to me. What if someone had entered the building? What if this someone was hiding on the roof? The police could take hours to arrive, and at that moment, the sound of the steps became so clear that the only thing I could do was run to the door and lock everything again. But I knew that wouldn't solve anything. It wasn't like I could prevent something that was already inside my head, or maybe inside my house. I didn't know what to do. The tension was unbearable, the sound of footsteps continued, and little by little, began to turn into something even more disturbing. A scratch, something as if they were trying to scrape their nails on the concrete. I found myself cornered inside my own apartment, trying to control my breathing while the dread consumed me. It was then that, without warning, the sound stopped abruptly. A total silence, as if everything had disappeared. Time seemed to drag on, and fear still prevented me from leaving. I looked at my cell phone as if, somehow, it would give me some consolation. I no longer knew if that was real, or if my mind had played a trick against me. I was about to collapse in tears, when suddenly I heard something that made my body freeze. A slight snap coming from above, as if someone had come down from an immense height. The only reaction I had was running to the window and looking at the roof, but obviously I didn't see anything. The sky was dark and without stars, and the building in front looked like a ghostly shadow. Down there, the street was empty. I knew it wasn't my mind playing tricks. There was something there, something that didn't make sense. Fear made me do one last thing. Take my things and leave for work much earlier than usual, not without first taking one last look at the ceiling. The next day, the story had no plausible explanation. No work on the building, no maintenance. There were no more steps, but the feeling that something happened on that roof, something I couldn't understand, stayed with me. And to this day, I can't get out of my head the feeling that perhaps something or someone has observed me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Since I moved into this rented house, something has always bothered me. It wasn't the neighborhood, nor the size of the house, which by the way was very spacious. But there was something in the air, something I couldn't identify. It was a strange feeling, a growing discomfort. I had moved alone to a new city, and the silence of the house made me think about things I would rather not think about. What bothered me the most was the sound. During the nights, always after midnight, I heard noises coming from the basement. It wasn't a simple creak of wood or wind, but something else. They looked like heavy dragged steps. Every time I heard it, my heart raced. I thought maybe it was some noisy neighbor, but something told me no. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just my imagination. When I asked the real estate agency about the basement, the answer was direct and quiet. Don't worry, the basement is closed and has no external access. That calmed me down, but also increased my curiosity. How could something be happening there without explanation? I knew that the rational answer was that it was just my head, but as the days went by, the noises only got worse. It was as if someone was downstairs, moving, sometimes even with a low laugh, but when I looked, there was nothing. One night, after hearing the noises once again, I finally found the courage to go to the basement. When I went down the stairs with the flashlight, my stomach was wrapped. The door was locked, but when I forced the doorknob, it gave in. What I found there left me speechless. The basement was dark, the smell of humidity in the air made me hesitate, but I decided to move on. The flashlight illuminated an empty corner, without furniture, just stacked cardboard boxes and a heap of old things. But when I looked at the farthest corner, something caught my attention. There was a backpack thrown there, forgotten, as if someone had left it there recently. My heart raced, fear began to take over me. I thought maybe it was an old outfit that the real estate company had forgotten to remove, but when I approached, I realized that it wasn't really that. The backpack was open and inside it, there were men's clothes, t-shirts, pants, even a used toothbrush, crumpled at the bottom. I couldn't control myself anymore. Something was wrong there. Someone was living in the basement, without me knowing. The mind began to work at full speed. How was this possible? The real estate agency had assured me that the basement was closed and without access. What made me even more tense was the idea that, if someone was there, they had been there for some time, without me noticing. I looked around, trying to find more clues, but the only sound I could hear was my own heavy breathing. Fear mixed with anger. How had someone settled there without me knowing? I was alone in the house. When I took a closer look at the backpack, I saw that there was also a wallet. I took it, and when I opened it, I found a card with the name of a man and the address of another neighborhood. My mind seemed to spin, but I couldn't connect the pieces. How could that be happening? My stomach turned and, with my wallet in my hand, I ran to the stairs. Something told me to get out of there as soon as possible. When I got to the stairs, I started to climb fast, almost stumbling on the steps. My body was cold with fear, but at the same time, my mind was 1,000. I needed to get out of that house as soon as possible, but before doing anything, I knew I needed to tell the real estate agency what I had found. When I got upstairs, still shaking, I called the real estate agency, trying to control my voice so it didn't sound so hysterical. When I told what I had found, the woman on the phone was silent for a moment, which only increased the feeling of panic in my chest. "This can't be possible," she finally said with a trembling voice. "I'll call someone to go there immediately." The call was interrupted, and I didn't know if this was good or bad news. I still held my wallet and looked at the basement door, where the noises of the night before seemed to intensify. For a moment, I thought I was listening to steps again, but I knew this could just be my mind playing tricks on me. Deep down, I felt that there was something very wrong, something I couldn't explain. Every little sound, every snarl seemed more threatening. My hands were sweating when finally the real estate agency called me back, asking me to stay in the house until someone arrived to investigate. I, of course, was petrified, but I knew I didn't have much to do but wait. However, something told me that I shouldn't be there alone. I looked out the window and saw the empty street, as if everything was in absolute silence. I couldn't trust anything around me anymore. When the doorbell rang, I almost jumped out of the place. I looked through the peephole and saw two men in work clothes, accompanied by a policeman. They entered quickly, and I began to explain what I had found in the basement. They came in, and the policeman made a sign for me to stay calm. One of the real estate men asked me to show him where the basement was, so, even with my heart beating fast, I started going down the stairs again, with everyone behind me. The environment was quiet, but my stomach seemed tight, as if something was about to happen. When we arrived at the basement door, the real estate man made a sign with his hand to the policeman, who then pulled a flashlight out of his backpack and began to illuminate the space. I just watched, feeling a growing fear, as if that moment was a kind of threshold. Something was about to be revealed. The policeman approached the door, took the doorknob and turned it slowly, as if he was expecting something. He opened it carefully, and everyone entered, illuminating the space with the lanterns. The smell of humidity and something old took over the air, but what caught my attention the most was the absolute silence. There was nothing in the basement but dust and some old furniture. The real estate men and the policemen began to search the place, as if they were trying to find anything that explained what was happening. That's when the policeman moved away a little and squatted to look under an old table, almost against the wall. "Here it is," he murmured. I was paralyzed when I saw him pull an old backpack, similar to the one I had found. My heart accelerated. He opened it, and inside it, there were men's clothes and a toothbrush, exactly as I had seen. The policeman looked at me with a serious look and then turned to the others. "This house is being used by someone. It seems that someone is living here without your knowledge, and it doesn't seem to be something recent," he said, calmly but seriously. I almost couldn't understand. What did that mean? "We'll have to investigate more. This is not just a case of someone breaking in. Someone was here a short time ago," he added, staring at me. My body was cold, and more than ever, I wished I had stayed away from this house. The policeman asked me to wait in the kitchen, and the feeling of helplessness took over me. They began to go through every corner of the house, checking the furniture, the cabinets, even the ceiling. I felt like an involuntary spectator of it all, unable to understand why no one had warned me that something so serious could have happened there. The real estate company seemed so carefree, as if everything was normal, but the reality was very different. I was beginning to realize that that place, which I thought was only a temporary home, kept secrets that went far beyond what I could imagine. I stayed there, alone in the kitchen, listening to their steps down the corridor and the sound of the lanterns cutting through the darkness of the house. Every noise seemed amplified, and I felt my stomach turn with each new movement. What I was experiencing didn't seem real. A part of me tried to rationalize everything, but another, more intense, couldn't stop thinking about the worst. Why would someone have left their things there? And the scariest thing, who would this person be? How did she manage to get in and out without me noticing? After a few minutes, the policeman returned to the kitchen, his face serious and expressionless. He explained to me that, apparently, the person responsible for these things was missing. He mentioned that they had already received some complaints about strange disappearances in the region, but, until that moment, nothing pointed to anything concrete. I just heard it, unable to fully process it. The policeman assured me that he would take the necessary measures, and that, for now, the house would be under surveillance. However, he also told me that I should seriously consider the possibility of leaving the place, since they didn't know who was involved in this case. I was still in shock, but I agreed. I felt that, although the house was under surveillance, the fear I felt would not disappear so easily. After the policeman left, I felt more relieved, but I still couldn't understand how no one knew anything, how it went unnoticed for so long. I was back in my room, trying to calm down, but I couldn't sleep that night. The sound of my own breaths was more deafening than any other noise I had heard in that house. When I closed my eyes, one last idea crossed my mind, an uncomfortable feeling that I couldn't ignore. Maybe that basement, that stuffy and forgotten space, had been just a place of passage for those who knew what was happening there. And somehow, I still had no idea how my destiny intertwined with his.